Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. In this episode, we have some technical details on SolarWinds bugs from ZDI, more YouTube shenanigans with an attack to snoop on YouTube history, and uploads through a malicious link, and breaking calling state machines. Before we jump into topics, though, I'll quickly mention, as some of you may have seen, we've been doing PS4 streams with Teamstar over the last week or two. We will be continuing the PS4 kernel exploit stream on Wednesday this week at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, 2:30 p.m. Pacific. With that said, though, let's jump into some news. So, we'll start off with a bit of a messy story here. This is somewhat politically tied. We're mostly going to focus on the fun angles of it, I think. But it's based around this platform. Is that the platform name? Albicla?
That's the platform name. It's supposed to be All Be Clear. And
Oh,
it was
okay.
some kind of amalgamation that they got this Albicla or whatever. But if you go to their website, All Be Clear is kind of their name or origin of that. And yeah, I mean, I just want to call this out more almost motivational. Like, if you've written bad code, just take a look at the list of issues that have been found in this and be happy your code hopefully was not as bad as this.
Some feel-good material.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's a Reddit post talking about some vulnerabilities found. You can Google around, find some other people talking about vulnerabilities that were discovered. So it seems like these are probably legitimate, but they don't have like a really good source that proves that these were found. So take that, take it with a grain of salt on that front. But a lot of the vulnerabilities there are things that you could imagine somebody doing wrong. So one of them here is somebody registered a user with the username delete_account, which of course, if you clicked on that, it would make you go to the URL, /delete_account, which also happened to be the URL to delete your account. So you would view their profile and delete your account. So acting on a get request as being one pretty common issue. And then just the fact that it happens to be with profile, you can delete accounts. So that's always fun. We've got some other here, some rate limiting issues, of course.
I thought the delete account one was particularly funny because they don't even support the ability to do that normally. So it's like, not only is it bad in the way you can delete other people's accounts, but you can use it to wipe your own account off the site if you wanted to. You could kind of self-exploit yourself, I guess. Yeah, there were a few other like really weird ones though, like being able to inspect element to write on people's walls even if you shouldn't. Like it seemed like they had a few checks that were client side and they had like no server side checks at all. You could also register with empty usernames and passwords by removing the checks for that on the client side.
Yeah, and I will just quickly mention there the inspect element part. That's using inspect element to remove the check. That would then let you make the normal request to write on somebody's wall. That's not like just editing it locally.
Yeah,
like that should be obvious, but if not, I want to call that out.
But yeah, just some like really funny issues, and it's funny because what was that platform that everyone was jumping on that AWS like pushed off and everything? Parler, yeah, they had some like pretty funny security issues too, where they had their site content dumped, and this kind of blows that out of the water. This is you know what this reminded me of when I looked through all the issues? This looked like something you'd see on like a hackathon site. So you set up like the hackathon site that's meant to look like a real like banking website or whatever, but it's just riddled with issues on purpose. That's almost what this would seem like it would be with how many issues are here.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what, according to this person, what they found in the last 26 hours.
Yeah, I mean, just brutal. But yeah, I mean, there's some other issues here too that we didn't really cover. If you want to get the full list, you can check out the link. But yeah, I mean, like you said, it kind of makes you feel a lot better about yourself.
Hopefully, at least.
Likely, if you've written something, it's probably not as bad as this in terms of number of bugs. So let's move into some exploits. So our first exploit is in the Windows NordVPN client, and it's an RCE through the notification protocol. Issue itself seems pretty straightforward. One of the classes from the notification protocol takes a user-provided URL and eventually just passes it to process.start. So it seems like you can
Yes.
just get the straight command injection
Yeah,
there.
kind of. So it takes a dictionary of string mapping to string. And that dictionary is the arguments. So it is a little bit complicated to actually get the command injection, but it is fairly easy to understand. It's just, you'd almost say it's like a little bit of obfuscation. They're not using it for that, like they're using it for a purpose, but because what will happen here is in the Nord registers the URL schema, so you can have like NordVPN // and actually have a link that does some. This is used, they're using it kind of for inter-process communication, but because they're registering it like that, you can just toss it on a web page. If somebody clicks it, you can potentially gain the code execution through this. It does have to be something that's already on the system, but like Spectre said, you effectively control a process that will be started, because this listen notification open URL passes in the open URL argument directly to the process start, giving you, the ability to start any arbitrary thing. The reason why it's a little bit more complicated is because the actual URL is this compress or object compressor.compress object and takes the toast args. So this is basically how they would pass a notification or get the toast notification thing to actually show a notification. So yeah, this is basically passed in. You'd have their new notification args, and then they compress it as an object, and that compressed string is what ends up being passed in the URL. So it looks like this, basically junk, base 64. That looks like, kind of looks like that. So it's not as easy as just having a random application there, but you do have complete control over what that will be.
Yeah. So the researcher posted a script that you can use to generate the malicious URL, and then you just toss that into an iframe source and serve it on an HTTP server, and it'll use that notification protocol to and it'll exploit it to launch your command. So kind of an interesting attack vector, I think.
Yeah, I mean, pretty
We've
common to see that. Like, we've definitely covered other URL handlers
Oh,
that
for
have
sure.
similar issues. I think we've covered like 4 or 5 in the past year. I did appreciate kind of the turtle shell here. He was the HackerOne triager. First came back basically rejecting it. Um, and then, of course, the reporter was like, no, you misunderstand. You don't need a... the reporter here provided this application that generates a string. So he rejected it, thinking it was a local privilege escalation. You don't get root or admin from this. It's admin because we're talking about Windows. So he rejected it initially, but then came back just a little bit later with, awesome bug. So I just appreciated kind of seeing that turnaround. He didn't try to defend himself, just basically admitted he was wrong and took it as an awesome bug. And I do think it's a fun bug, especially because it isn't immediately obvious how you'd exploit that without digging into it to see how it generates the string that it uses,
Yeah.
or how it parses it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen that turtle shell quite a bit in HackerOne reports. He's like the hardest working triager there, I guess. I don't know, but he seems to be like a pretty reasonable person when it comes to back and
Yeah,
forth
I
with the
guess
researcher.
maybe the only reason I'm kind of thinking about that is because we had the reporter from Bug Crowd, I think it was last time, or on one of the previous episodes. A less positive encounter with the triager.
Yep, that was Bug Crowd. Yep. But yeah, interesting issue. That said, we can move on to our next one. So this was on SolarWinds. So after a month or so, we have a blog post by ZDI on 3 issues in the SolarWinds Orion platform. These issues were found through end-day analysis, so they weren't 0 days. But one of the issues was tied to the SolarWinds attack that we talked about before. So when these issues are chained together, they can allow unauthenticated code execution as admin on a victim system. So all these issues were found in the REST API used for configuration. So the first issue, which was linked to the Sunburst attack, was an issue in the alert system, which allowed you to execute a Visual Basic script when an alert was triggered. And you can make it execute a script that's hosted on a remote SMB share. So you can get arbitrary VBS execution through that. That would already be kind of weird enough that they would allow you to do that functionality, although it is behind an admin wall, which I'll talk about later. But the main issue is that the interpreter parameter is controlled in the body of the API request. So there's a straight up command injection there. You can just change the interpreter from wscript.exe to cmd.exe or something similar to run arbitrary commands. You could also make it run batch files instead, which makes getting command execution even easier.
Yeah, so you
Uh,
just mentioned there that it was behind an admin wall. When I was reading this, I thought this was behind user. Was I mistaken about that? I thought it didn't require administrative privileges. You did have to log in for it, but I didn't think it found it or required, administrative access on that.
yeah, sorry, you're right. It is user, so it's behind authentication. That's what I should have said. I
There. Okay.
misspoke there. Yeah. The second issue was an SQL injection in the feature that allows you to send post requests to a server. If the post body included $sign curly brace SQL colon, the string inside of that was evaluated as an SQL statement with apparently no sanitization. So in their example, they use that to take over the admin account by changing its password hash. The third issue is what allows you to exploit the first two, because those two issues are behind authentication, like we were talking about earlier. And in order to get to that those bugs, you need to be able to bypass the authentication, and that's what the third issue is. It's an auth bypass, and that's because the app allows certain resources to go through without authentication. So, like mostly for things like assets, like CSS and JavaScript files.
Yeah, like all of these are one of the big things. The I-18N or internationalization code is one of the things it looks for. Oh, this is the only one that I feel like is an actual. Well, it's not the other ones aren't vulnerabilities or aren't issues, but this is the only one that I feel like isn't by design. The first two issues, and I guess I kind of interrupted Spec before he's finished there, but it would skip authentication if it saw like i18n.ashx in the URL or web resource, script resource. So I said if the path appeared to be requesting a static resource, it would not perform authentication. That way they could serve like CSS and JavaScript or internationalization information without requiring the login. So you can actually read the login page in like another language or have JavaScript on the page, etc. It's just that it was such a poor check because they only looked for these keywords to be in the path. So you can make a request to any page and just have that keyword as part of the path later on. But I did want to talk about the first two there. Like, they're genuine features of the application. Well, being able to change like the W script to command isn't, but having the script execution when I believe the first one was it an alert? Yeah, the first one was an alert that would happen. So when an alert would happen, you could execute an external VB script. Like that's a genuine feature. The second one, again, like maybe they need to have queries accessible as something you need to send over on an action occurring. Like that does make somewhat sense. So I don't know. They're the type of thing that if I was doing a review of the application, one, I mean, I would be calling out, yeah, the fact that it's not behind administrative or not locked behind its own. Requiring authentication would be one way of protecting these sorts of pages, is requiring you to enter your password at this point, which I wonder how it would have worked out because of the auth bypass skip. But doing something like that can kind of help protect these sensitive pages, but they are kind of features that are available by design. Like the SQL injection, you're entering something that starts with SQL there to tell it that this is a SQL query to run. So like it's definitely there by design. So I mean,
Yeah, I guess the way I'd summarize that is that the first two issues aren't really issues without the third issue. Like they put it behind authentication. They probably know what the capabilities are. Somebody could exploit that, and that's why it's behind auth.
Yeah, like
they just didn't really
SolarWinds
handle the authentication properly.
Yeah, like SolarWinds Orion kind of feels like the type of application you're not just handing out access to either. That said, I don't know what their authentication system is like. Like, if they had a more granular authentication where it's like you give this user access to this particular feature, and so the people having access to add the scripts are kind of restricted beyond just being a user. If it was only like user and admin, I can see this maybe being something that should have been held off behind admin or held a little bit higher. But yeah, it's just, I wouldn't call it like SQL injection. Like it is, or even command injection. Like those are proper features of the application. You just need to consider the security ramifications of having such features exposed. And as I was saying before, it's the type of thing where, like, if I came across it, I would report on the fact, like, you should probably have more authentication in front of this, like an additional layer, because it's a sensitive function. But I'd be trying to lay out kind of the security concerns that you have by exposing it, not so much calling the feature itself a bug. Now, just because it is intentional, it is something that they decided to include. Like, there's business reasons behind that. I'd be curious to know kind of how they fixed that. Like, if they did just add or just put it behind admin, or if they added some extra layer of authentication, or what their fix was there.
Yeah, kind of like
Go ahead.
you said with them being intended features. I find it interesting they got assigned CVEs. I did you actually look
Yeah,
at any of the CVEs for them? I didn't.
that's
I'm trying to.
exactly where I was kind of feeling too, was just the fact that they were given CVs, and it feels a little bit. So being able to change a W script over to command, actually, I think can be CVE worthy. Um, just going from that to the arbitrary execution. So that one I think is fair game. I mean, the SQL injection though isn't. It's a feature, so.
So I will quickly note, at least the CVE that I've looked at for like the SQL injection, for example, that is reserved. So it seems like it's there's not really anything on the CVE. So
At least
I thought
not
I'd point
yet.
that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good point. It's. But I mean, if it's reserved, uh, not rejected or anything, so we'll see what happens there. I mean, it's still something worth kind of tracking the fact of, like, if they did make this change, if they did change it, add more authentication, you've got the CV to kind of track it. That's fair. Like, I'm not saying you can't assign CVs. Just, it does feel a little bit, not CV-ish.
Yeah. What I found interesting was the fact that they linked that first issue, which was that alert script execution. They linked that to being used in the Sunburst attack, but the actual, like, the main issue here is that authentication bypass, and they don't say that that was tied to Sunburst. So I wonder if that attack used a different authentication bypass, or if it was. I don't know all the like details around Sunburst, so
Yeah, and I don't know what would have been used there either. I do know they had something with like Microsoft No 365 authentication. I know that was talked about very early on.
yeah,
So it's possible that that could have been relayed to the authentication used here if they would integrate. I'd assume Office 365 provides a SAML integration, and most enterprisey software like this would integrate with SAML also. So I would assume, like, if they had something there, that would have been more useful than just that auth bypass, but it's pure speculation. I have no idea.
yeah, something we can't really say like definitively what happened there, but it was just something that I was kind of had a question on when I was reading this and
Yeah,
thought was
and
kind of
took note
interesting.
of.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, like that authentication bypass is the only like true big issue there. So we'll get into one of our headlining topics, YouTube. We have the return of interesting YouTube bugs from David Hu. So this is the same researcher who wrote up the private video bug we talked about in episode 59. This one is centered around playlists. If you've used YouTube quite a bit, you may notice you have some internally managed playlists that you don't explicitly create, but YouTube kind of manages for you. So that includes your watch history, your liked videos, your uploads, as well as some other stuff. Like I think it creates recommended playlists for you too and stuff like that. And those playlists have IDs, so you can kind of see where this is going. It's kind of another IDOR type attack. Now, normally for something like the uploads playlist, if you go to someone's upload playlist, the privacy settings are still in effect. So if somebody links their uploads playlist and it's usually on your channel page, videos that are unlisted are still not going to show there. Private videos obviously aren't going to show there. And the history playlist won't be shown. But if you're logged in, then it shows differently for you. It shows all that information. And where it gets interesting is when it comes to the YouTube iframe API for embedding players in third-party sites. The user is obviously still logged in through YouTube in the iframe, but the page contents can be controlled by the site owner, which could obviously be malicious. So a site owner can just put code in the page that will interact with the player to pull playlist information, and it will.
Yeah,
Now,
which
usually,
is an intended part of the design there. Like, it's not necessarily malicious to want to get the playlist. If you're
no.
writing code to interact with the player, seeing what the playlist actually contains kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
it seems kind of like an unhandled edge case or like something that wasn't thought about
yeah,
when
like
designing it.
this feels. I don't want to say a side channel, but in my notes I wrote this kind of like the side door, or the back door into it, because your actual access, um, basically isn't going to let you see these things, but you've kind of got this side door to get access to it, which is the embedded player.
Yeah. Now, usually, this would be a cool issue, but you would think it would be similar to the last issue we covered, where needing to know the ID would be a high requirement. In this case, it's a different story, though, because the playlist IDs are literally your channel ID with a special prefix. So, like for liked videos, it was your channel ID with LLD or LLB at the front of it, and UUD or UUB for uploads. And channel IDs are public. If you go to somebody's channel on YouTube, the channel ID is in the URL. So yeah, it's kind of interesting where before with the video, like when we were talking about the private video bug, it was like, it's kind of cool, but you're not going to be able to get those private video IDs. Here, it's very easy to get those playlist IDs. So the attack is more practical in that sense. It allows you to get history, which is potentially sensitive, as well as unlisted videos, which honestly are probably used more often than private videos because they're a lot more convenient to share with friends without requiring them to log in or whatever. And this attack could actually be chained with the previous attack, if it weren't patched, obviously, to end up getting the IDs for those private videos in the first place. So this attack I thought was a lot cooler than the private video one. Although the private video one was more interesting in how it worked with like pulling the preview images, but this one I think is definitely a lot more practical. Um, in terms of like usefulness and trying to pull somebody's private, or maybe not private videos, but unlisted videos
Yeah,
at
the
least.
unlisted ones definitely a lot more useful, a lot more practical as an attack. And I will just kind of mention here that this is kind of abusing post messages again. You're able to connect, or sorry, like the information shared back and forth with the post message API. You didn't really mention that when we were talking about it, but that is kind of how you're able to hook and get all of the information that's being passed back and forth. I mean, it's not really abusing it because this post message is meant to be called back to the parent frame or like whatever's containing it, so that's fine. But I did just want to call out this is kind of another post message thing too. Definitely more practical, as you were saying, though. I kind of like this bug. I mean, like I said, it's a side door. It's a logical issue. It's not like some crazy technical bug. It's just there's this side way or unthought of way of accessing it, as you said earlier, an edge case. So I'm actually really liking the research this guy's putting out.
Yeah, it's cool. Um, I was just looking at some of the fix information. It seems the way they fixed it was if you give any of those special playlists to the endpoint, it won't let you do it. It'll just return an error. So you can get like their public playlists, but the history playlist, the upload playlist, all that stuff that won't work over the API, which makes sense. That was probably the way it should have been handled. Was just like special playlists not allowed through the API. There's no reason for it really. But yeah, I mean, it seems to be kind of a theme of a lot of the issues we're covering today. Is just it's not really a technical flaw as much as it's just a design issue where there was an oversight on how the feature could be abused. Getting into more technical issues, though, we have a Project Zero post. So Project Zero made an appearance with a post about investigating call state machines for platforms like Facebook Messenger, Duo, Signal, and a few others. Basically, platforms that use WebRTC for implementing their calling systems for video calling and stuff. So this post from Natalie Silvanovich, a lot of the focus was around callee consent. making sure that a potential victim has to accept the call instead of just auto connecting it. Because if they can just auto connect it, then an actor can eavesdrop on video or audio or whatever. Um, and one of the interesting things with WebRTC is when using it, the applications have to maintain their own state machines. And any vulnerabilities that can impact the integrity of that state machine could be used to possibly bypass that consent requirement. And that's exactly what they ended up finding issues in here with all these messaging apps. So I'll go through them kind of one by one. With Signal, they found it was possible to establish a peer-to-peer connection, and when a peer-to-peer connection is established, the callee's audio track is added when they accept the call, and a message is sent back to the caller telling it to auto-connect and add its track. But it never checked that the device receiving that connect message is actually the caller. So the caller can just send that message to the callee as if the callee initiated the call, and that leads to being able to establish a call even without the callee's consent. So that was fixed in 2019. GeoChat and Mocha had kind of similar issues. They tried to establish a connection over WebRTC with the callee first, and then just gated the audio and video until the call was accepted. But there was a design issue because they didn't factor in how powerful WebRTC is. Once a connection is established, there's multiple ways to start a peer-to-peer connection, and the ways that are supported can be probed for by using candidates. So if there's any candidates that can be used, that gate can basically be circumvented. So on GeoChat, that led to being able to get audio transmitted, and on Mocha, they got both audio and video. Um, Duo probably had the most interesting issue to me. They had a race condition, which led to the leaking of video packets.
Yeah, and I'll mention that we talked about this issue back on episode 56.
I thought we did.
Yeah,
I meant
it
to
felt
go look
really
before
familiar.
the episode.
And yeah, it was episode 56 where we talked about the actual issue, like the report itself from Project Zero.
Yeah, when I was reading, I was like, this is definitely something that we would have covered, but I didn't double check. So thanks for confirming that. But yeah, this is still probably the most interesting issue of the bunch. It was the race condition, which is because when Duo receives a call, it sends a one-way video stream to the caller, so the callee can preview it first. But it doesn't enforce that properly. It uses an STP property to make it one-way only, but that property can be changed because that STP is provided by the caller, not the callee. And when it disables that outgoing video traffic, it does it asynchronously. So that's why there's that race condition where it's possible that traffic makes it out before it's disabled.
Yeah, so I'll clarify on that a little bit. The erase condition would happen because the disabling that part of the stream would only happen after the connection was not fully created, but there's an asynchronous call, the set locale description, I think it was. After that happened, then it would go. So they would, spam a bunch of data messages which are running on the same thread as that set locale gets called on, and that would delay the set locale finishing, which would delay the callback for set locale being finished successfully.
Mm-hmm. So Messenger was the most complicated one they hit. That's Facebook Messenger, because it had a lot of reversing involved. And it was the only app out of the ones they investigated that used C++ bindings for WebRTC instead of Java. And the reason that makes it more difficult is anybody who's looked at Java, like reverse Java, you have bytecode to work with. It's a lot easier to see calls into libraries and stuff like that. Whereas with C++, it gets a lot trickier to do that.
Yeah, they also they'd statically link the library in there, so they were able to strip the symbols.
Yeah.
So they do talk about some of the reverse engineering process of this one too, instead of just the vulnerability. So there are some interesting tidbits there. Yeah.
Yeah. So it too had an issue where it tried to use set local description to set the audio and video descriptions to inactive and change them when the call was accepted, or just wouldn't call that function at all. But the caller can force a description update by sending an STP update message. So if that's sent while the phone is ringing, it can leak audio back. And I don't know if we talked about it on the podcast, but I certainly remember hearing about this issue as well back when it happened. And I think, was it in October that it was reported? I feel like I remember hearing about this issue with Messenger where you could call somebody while it was ringing, and it would leak audio back. I don't remember if there were
Um,
technical details
I
at the
don't
time, though.
remember talking about for Messenger. I remember us talking about a WhatsApp one back in late 2019. I don't recall
Maybe I'm
talking
getting
about
the
Messenger.
Facebooks
Yeah.
confused because they're all owned by Facebook. But yeah, maybe it was WhatsApp. Fair enough. Yeah, basically you can leak audio back when the phone's ringing. Overall, though, these are very interesting issues. Not only are these kind of unique and logical type bugs, but they're also pretty impactful. Like these can be used to spy on people maliciously. And it's interesting how something as simple as handling call consent can become so tricky when you're dealing with things like WebRTC and managing your state,
Yeah,
either due to unknown features of the protocol or just incorrect state handling.
and I thought it was interesting on the Facebook one in particular that they kind of acted differently depending on whether or not you were on a single device or multiple devices, which I mean kind of makes sense in what they're doing, but it was the fact they acted differently is where you were able to create like the SDP update would only add audio if you were across multiple devices because it would use that as a trigger to know which device you were actually going to answer the call from. So like it makes sense that it's separated. If there's multiple devices, it doesn't know which stream to actually add, like which audio connection and video connection to actually add. So it makes sense, but that difference is where the vulnerability came in. Like this whole report is all just about basically being able to do some slightly unexpected things, either not fully understanding the protocol or just going out of order. Ultimately led to bugs like the one there was if you included, yeah, the GeoChat one, or Mocha. I don't know how to say if that's GeoChat or how that's supposed to be said, but
I don't know either.
I've never used that. But that one where, you know, if you just included the connection information earlier, the candidate information early, suddenly it's like, okay, we'll connect and ignore the fact that the server was kind of gating that information from you because it was shared earlier. So just establish the connection. Just those little things, like they're common issues when you have these sort of state machines going on that need to be tracked.
It
But
just
it
seems like they're
was,
not really looked at that much.
well, it's because you've really got to kind of think about everything. It's kind of where I come down on talking about how when you want to attack something, take the time to understand how it works. You don't necessarily need to like go build the entire system up or something by yourself. But the one phrase I like is time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. Or the idea
That's a
that,
good quote.
um, there's another quote I kind of like on a similar vein though. It's I find planning essential, but plans useless. Something like that. I probably butchered the quote, but that idea where it's like that process of going through the planning and doing that reconnaissance is really useful. The actual plans, maybe not so much, but actually just sitting down and understanding it so you can think about the system and reason about it is quite useful, as you can see with this case. It's the type of issue where you've actually got to understand what's going on or to exploit it. It's not just following some like, you know, put in a single quote and see what happens. It's you've got to think about it. So I
Yeah,
mean,
I
it's
mean
nice to see it laid out here.
that's the case with a lot of exploitation, right? You can read about like even if you're doing binary like memory corruption, you can read about it all day long, but in the end, you're not really gonna learn about how everything works until you actually try to do it and struggle through it. So yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, we always talk about P0 blog posts being good, but this is probably the most interesting one I've read in a while. I actually like this blog post better than the In the Wild posts even. I just, I guess, just because it's kind of an attack surface that I've never really looked at or considered. So I learned quite a few interesting little pieces of information in here. So yeah, I really like this blog post, and they had a lot of like useful diagrams and stuff too that helped. Like each issue had a diagram of the rough flow of how things worked, and that helped a lot. Where I'm not familiar with WebRTC and working with it. So yeah, really good blog post. So KindleDrip. So this was three bugs chained together that led to a remote code execution in Kindles. All they needed to know to exploit the issues was the email that was assigned to the device. So the initial vector of getting code execution on the Kindle was through sending malicious ebooks. So you send malicious ebooks to it to get it installed, and then they exploited the bug in the browser to get a foothold, and then escalated to root with the final issue. So the first issue leads to actually getting the Kindle or the ebook on the Kindle. In my little note, I had getting the Kindle on the ebook. I don't think that's the right direction.
Well, that's maybe more interesting, like Kindle
More interesting
emulator
attack.
inside of the ebook or something. But yeah,
That would be fun.
and this was kind of email spoofing is, well, now I've spoiled what the vulnerability was, but yeah, email spoofing. If you know, so you could send an email where the attachment was a Mobi file, the ebook file. You send that over to the Kindle's email, which is predictable. It's just based on what your email was for Kindle, except it's at kindle.com. Instead, if it overlaps with somebody else's, they just append a random token that I think they mentioned about 32 bits of entropy. So you can kind of brute force that. Might take a little while because this is network, this is email, but you can do it. So you would send that. That would get it on the device itself. It had to come from like a pre-approved list of emails. And I don't think they really talk about how they get that pre-approved list of emails. I'm assuming, though, that there's probably one that's like Amazon at Kindle or something, or like Kindle at Amazon. Like some really well-known one that's just going to be approved. But I can imagine, like, if a user adds their own email to send it, like, you need to know that email also, which might be a little bit harder to know. That is something I don't think they really talked about how they dealt with or gave enough information, but the gist of it, you can easily spoof an email. Just, it's basically like or it's very similar to like HTTP. It's a text-based protocol sent over. There's no real authentication. You just say who it's from as one of like the headers, basically. So very easy to spoof. That said, most email services will actually validate it. They'll validate that the server is correct, that the server that it was sent from is actually a server that's authenticated to send emails for that domain. If you don't have that configured, then they'll just treat it as spam. Kindle, however, just did no validation on that, which maybe was a design decision. Maybe it was just an oversight. I could kind of see an argument going both ways, as like, somebody's running their own mail server. But I feel like for the majority of users, if they just required you to have like the DKIM record and all of that set up, that would have been sufficient to prevent this initial foothold. And the vast majority of users are going to be using like Gmail, Hotmail, Proton Mail, something like that is set up correctly. I feel like it's such an edge case that I doubt. I imagine this was more of an oversight than an intended feature, but I could see somebody having argued for it to be intentional. Yeah, email is really easy to spoof. Like I said, they just used an email spoofing server or service to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to go on to the next one.
Yeah, all good. So once they got that malicious ebook on the Kindle, they managed to exploit an issue in the JPEG XR library. And this was when parsing the quantization parameters from the header. So one thing it takes is the number of channels, and usually there's a maximum of 16 channels. And in the library, there's usually an assertion to prevent passing more channels than 16. For whatever reason, in the Kindle version, that assertion wasn't there. So you could just pass any number of channels that you wanted, even though there was that maximum of 16. So you can kind of see where that's going. There's an out of bounds right there. And that actually leads to an absolute write, which they use to write shellcode into an area that's both writable and executable. Which at first I was like, okay, that seems kind of dumb. Why do they have that? But I guess where it's a browser, maybe it's used for JIT or something like that. So yeah, they can write shellcode into an area that's both writable and executable, and then they use the exploit again to write into the GOT to the global offset table to pivot to that shellcode. So that gave them code execution in user. And then the final issue is the privilege escalation. They hit a root process called stackdumpd, which is it's a debugging process. It basically takes a thread ID and a process ID, it passes it off to another program called dumpstack, which connects to the crash process with GDB and dumps the stack contents. It does seem weird that they would keep that debugging functionality on a retail unit. You would think they would just keep that on like in-house systems, but yeah. Anyway, they have those processes, and the thread ID wasn't quoted when it was passed into GDB, so there was an issue with command injection there. They did try to prevent command injection by ensuring the thread ID was a number, They use A2I, which for those not familiar with like C or any language that use that type of function, it's a function for converting a string to an integer. And they also tried using a regular expression, but they managed to bypass both by just putting the command they wanted to execute on a new line after a valid number to pass those checks. So they tried to prevent it. It's just the checks were flimsy,
Yeah,
so
and
they were able to
I kind of
get
want
the
to
command
call
injection.
out those two checks. So A to I being checked just looked, does A to I return a number? So that's where they just added a number to the start of the string, and when it hits the characters, when A to I hits those characters, it basically just stops there and returns the number that it parsed out. So you get a number back, all good. The regex is a little bit more interesting, I think, because it's more common that you'll even run into this. And that is, you'll notice here in the regex, they use the caret character here and the $sign to kind of match the start and the end of a string. The idea here is that you would match the start of the string, 0 to 9, with some number of them, end of the string. So you would, in theory, be matching the entire string with that, but the caret and $sign actually only match the beginning and ends of lines, unless you run it in another mode. So because it's not multi-line, that's where if they added that new line, they could basically have more, but still have the grep actually match something, or have the regex, sorry, match something there, because they didn't do a multi-line. That is a really common issue. If you're not aware of the fact that, like, you need to be running either multi-line or you need to use, I think it's \A and \Z. If you're not aware of that, it's really common to see this sort of bug happen in regex parsing. So I just wanted to call that one out specifically. Yeah, they were able to get the execution there straight up into command injection as root, which then gives you access to like all the information stored on the Kindle. They mention at the top here, all the way up to using your credit card. So pretty significant bug there. An interesting chain too.
Yeah, good shout on the regular expression details. So the issues were reported on October 17th. They were acknowledged on the 19th and paid out $12,000 bounty on November 4th. And they also got a holiday bonus as well, which was pretty cool. Patches were shipped on December 10th. There's also some cool fix information that the author provided, which is nice. We don't always see that in these kinds of write-ups. Basically, for the first issue, Amazon now sends verification links when it can't authenticate the sending address instead of just auto-downloading the book. With JPEG XR, they now check the channel count. And with the final issue, with StackDumpD, they implemented a more robust function to check the thread ID to make sure it consists of digits instead of using just that A2I check. So the regular expression, I don't know if they changed the regular expression. That wasn't stated in the fixes section, but that first check,
They do
it
say
seems,
at
has
the
been
end
bolstered
here,
up more.
That the check is a little bit more robust.
Yeah. I don't know if that was
Based
referring to their function or if that was referring to the regular expression, though.
Well, they do show the regex check is now more robust at the end there, and they show the new regex checks. Basically, they're just shrinking it down to a single line, and they use that single line value.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I somehow skipped over that, so yeah, thanks for pointing that out. But yeah, like, I would like to kind of call that out on the write-up. I love it when we do get to see the fixed stuff. Now, obviously, in some cases, it's not very easy to get that fixed information. The vendor might not give it to you. If it's like a closed source thing or whatever, it might not be easy to get that fix anyway. But it's just one of those nice things to see in a write-up, because we like to speculate a lot on how you would fix these types of issues, and when you have like a definitive statement in there about how they were fixed, that's just a nice add to see in write-ups. So yeah, I wanted to shout that out.
So I've actually cut this next little bit of content out from our episode. In this episode, along with episodes 55 and 49, we are covering a blog post on Broven.io. We've decided to cut their content as Google's threat analysis group indicated that this blog was actually part of a malicious campaign targeting security researchers. In particular, the blog was used to potentially compromise visitors who were running a fully patched Chrome browser on Windows 10. We've included a link to the report from Google in the description, and that also includes a listing of the indicators of compromise, which I would encourage everybody to check their system for.
All right, so we'll move from browser to kernel. So we have yet another bug in the extended VPF verifier in Linux. Interestingly, this one is technically a 0-day on Debian 9 because it's running an unpatched version of the kernel. It affects the LTS 4.9 to 4.13 kernels. Bad calculations in the BPF unsigned right shift instruction is what this issue can be summarized as. In the code, you can see that it tries to set the minimum and maximum values on the destination register in order to range the operation, but it obviously doesn't do that properly.
Yeah, and
It gets them mixed up.
I'll quickly jump in, just mention, so with eBPF stuff, the Linux kernel will try to make sure that basically it's not having any like memory violations. It'll use some emulation to calculate what values everything can hold. It'll do some checks to make sure that the code itself is loop free. It's just kind of like its own little architecture. It's got its own little instructions and stuff that can be executed. I want to say more like a bytecode, I guess. So that's where this vulnerability comes in. It's basically doing the calculation of what are the maximum and minimum values that the results of this right shift can hold, and it does them basically in the opposite ways that it should, which I thought was really interesting as a bug. I'm not sure why I just ended up at a Squarespace login for those of you watching, but that is not part of the vulnerability. But if you look at the calculation here, it'll do the shift to figure out the minimum value by shifting it to the right by the minimum value, and to calculate the max value, it shifts it to the right by the maximum value, which would work if you were doing a left shift to calculate, but because the right shift is kind of like dividing by 2, shifting the bits to the right by 1 is the same as doing a division by 2, you would actually want to do the shift as a for the minimum value that's going to hold, you'd want to shift it the maximum number of times, and for the maximum value that it can hold, you'd want to do the shift the minimal value of time. So you basically end up calculating the opposite values here, which I thought it's just kind of a fun bug. It's one of those things that this is probably like a copy and paste error. They did, and I didn't have a chance to go look the left shift code, but I would imagine they probably do it really similar and just in their head thought, okay, min value, or use the min here, max value, use the max, and mess it up because of that. It's a really subtle issue, or kind of a subtle issue, and just frankly a fun issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it seems to be it's one of those issues that trips people up in math and school and stuff like that too. That idea where when you're dividing by a large number, you're going to get a smaller number. I mean, it's something you deal with in like elementary school, but I can see how you could easily skip it over in code. I'm not trying to like throw shade or anything there, but yeah, it's literally just a mix up of operators and operands there. If either one of them were switched around, it would work fine. It's just you can't have both the way they are. So yeah, I guess moral of the story is just remember your mathematics, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess should be mentioned here for clarity's sake, because of this error in calculation, you're able to have a memory reader write that goes out of bounds. Like because it calculates the min and max incorrectly, it also ends up calculating whether or not it is a legitimate, or whether or not there's any memory violations. The check basically will think it passes, even though it doesn't.
And much like browser, out of bounds read write is pretty much guaranteed to be exploitable in kernel in most cases. So
yeah. So
yeah.
Should mention it was exploitable. We spent all our time talking about the bug itself, which I mean is a fun kind of bug. I do want to take one question out of chat, which is from Cat3009, and that is, what do you think about HackTheBox? And I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of HackTheBox. I think it has its place. Like, I mean, if you enjoy it, all power to going on there and doing them. What I've seen from HackTheBox, though, it's not something I enjoy, I guess is what I'll say. I mean, plenty of people do, plenty of people learn stuff from it. I feel like it pushes maybe a little bit more towards the I don't want to say NetSec because like a lot of the issues are NetSec, but a lot more towards what the pen tester would do rather than I've always been more of an application security guy. So I'm not going to spend time, brute forcing whether or not the, credentials for something. Like, I'm not going to spend brute forcing that to find out if they're weak or not. That's not really, like, that's more of a configuration issue that isn't really relevant to the application security itself, unless it's like a default password or something. Like, that's a little bit different. And I feel like HackTheBox ends up having a lot of things that are focused around like that, the enumeration, just things that I guess actually that on the brute force and enumeration, I don't like seeing those in challenges purely because you run that and you're doing nothing. You're not able to work on anything more until you figure out, oh, my config here, my choices for the brute force were wrong or right. Yeah, it's just a lot of dead time when doing them. I mean, it's fair, especially for pen testers. Like, that's part of the job. You're going to need to be thinking about that, doing that. It's a great resource. Like, it's not that I think HackTheBox is bad. It's just not really something that holds my interest personally. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a platform that's gotten popular, and the fact they have a ton of challenges going up there if you are to play on the retired machines with the paid option. And they have some larger labs there, I think, on HackTheBox Pro. The larger labs there. I mentioned Slayer Labs last episode, I think it was. It's equivalent with that. I think Slayer Labs a bit cheaper, but for HackTheBox Pro, I think there's a use for it if that's the area that you're interested in. It's just not the area I'm terribly interested in. I've done a handful of NetPen. And yeah, out of chat again, there are also challenges in Pwn. There are challenges in Pwn. They are there, but that doesn't really seem to be the focus of HackTheBox or really the emphasis. They're just kind of there. So if I were going to do Pwn, I'd probably be looking elsewhere. Like, there are challenge sites for doing Pwn and stuff that I feel are a lot better resource than HackTheBox. I mean, it's there. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm not trying to hate on HackTheBox. I think it does some good stuff. It's just not really a platform that I personally have enjoyed being on. But yeah, I mean, if you do, motivation's the most important thing. So, if it keeps you motivated.
Yeah, I'm much along the same lines. I feel like I tried it a while back, and it's just I didn't really find it all that interesting, so I didn't really stick with it. But yeah. One thing I did want to quickly add on to the kernel, the Linux kernel eBPF issue before we move on, is it is worth noting because you have to use pointer to map values for the register types. You do need capsys admin capability to exploit this issue. So it's not like this is an unprivileged to kernel local privilege escalation, because that would be really significant. The impact is kind of limited there by needing the capsys admin capability. I don't know if you could acquire that capability by using user namespaces. I don't know how that works with eBPF.
I am almost certain you could not get capsys admin with
it probably uses the root user namespace. It probably doesn't use
yeah, I can't imagine it would let you grab it that way.
Yeah. So it is quite limited. This is basically an admin to kernel privesc, which is pretty small, but still it's a cool bug. I just wanted to point that out quickly. But yeah, we can move into shoutouts. So Z, I'll let you kick it off with your shoutout, and then I'll move into mine.
Yeah, and there's not much to say here. There's bad pods, Kubernetes pod privilege escalation. Just a write-up from Bishop Fox Lab about effectively, doing a privilege escalation on Kubernetes. Didn't really want to cover the entire issue or all of the issues that they cover, because they cover several. They're just based around, one bad configuration, one bad attribute being set leads to you being able to escape. But I did want to call it out as a resource for anybody who wants to dig into that a little bit more. I mean, Bishop Fox, their labs generally put out some really solid research, and this is just another one of them.
All right, cool. So I have along the lines of the BPF stuff, I have a Linux kernel exploitation shoutout. This is the third part to a Linux kernel exploitation blog series that was started by Keith McCann. The first two were about debugging the kernel and smashing stack overflows, as it's called. This one is taking that stack overflow to privilege escalation. So it is an artificially induced bug through a loadable driver. It's more beginner oriented. You might not find a lot of value in it if you're experienced with Linux kernel exploitation. I still think it could be of interest to some of our listeners, though. If you're interested in getting into exploitation and kernel exploitation specifically, this is probably worth checking out. There are some tricks and strategies in here that you could pull out and apply to real world exploits for sure, such as the common strategy of preparing kernel creds and committing creds to get root credentials. If you're not familiar with Linux kernel exploits, you might not be familiar with that strategy, but this blog post and this issue will kind of take you through that without having to deal with all the crap that you would have to deal with in a real 0 day or something like that, or a real end day. So this is a really good starting point, I think, if you're looking to get into kernel exploitation.
Yeah, and
And
actually,
there's stuff that can be taken away.
related to that, I will also give a shout out to Pwn College, which we have talked about at least once on the show before. I think more than once. And the first time we talked about it, we actually pulled up the module on kernel exploitation. We pulled up the slides, and definitely lacking, and the slides definitely are still lacking, but they now have the YouTube lecture that goes along with it. So like there is a little bit more information going on with Pwn College now that they've actually run the course, because we first came across it before the course had actually been run. So they stream that on Twitch and archive it on YouTube. So kind of similar for getting into like the really basic aspects of the Linux kernel exploitation. Is, you know, Pwn College is also there as another possible resource.
Cool. So I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you to everyone who tuned it in. I know we did go a little bit shorter this week. That's just because we've had the other streams going on and stuff. It's been a busy week.
Yeah, and
But yeah,
trying to keep our episodes a little bit shorter than 2.5 hours.
yeah, for sure. But yeah, you can catch the VODs on Twitch or YouTube at 6 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, with previous podcasts also up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more links on Anchor. So you can check Anchor for all those links. You can also feel free to join our Discord and follow us on Twitter. Links are in the description. Once again, we will be continuing the PS4 kernel exploit stream on Wednesday this week at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, 2:30 p.m. Pacific. With that said, though, we will be back again next week at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific for the podcast, and we'll see you then.